doesn't seem to me like YouTube is on.
Good. Give it a sec.
Can I try sharing my screen?
Please.
Please do.
Okay, there we go.
Can you all see the title slide?
No, not yet.
Yeah, so right now it's going to whoever's speaking. Can we get the YouTube to show Collin?
It'll show Collin when he's speaking. It's by default speaker view. I don't think I can control that aspect of it.
Oh,
Are you trying to share, Collin?
yeah, I have shared.
We don't see anything being shared at the moment.
There you
Now
go.
we do.
Okay, now you see
Yeah.
the title slide?
We do.
Great. 5 months into this thing, we're still figuring it out.
Still adapting. People are arriving. Hi, Anna. Hi, Joe. You two are muted.
You see the note?
Mm.
You can.
Okay, so it's 12 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. We are gonna give just a few minutes for people to start to arrive. But Joe Barry would like to make an announcement. So Joe, if you would like to do it now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as you have all surely noted this morning, we got an announcement from Eric Isaacs that made the formal confirmation or announcement that Anna Mikczak's has been appointed the new director of the Department of Global Ecology. So first, I want to congratulate Anna on this event. I think we've all been very impressed with Anna's leadership and her ability to keep us organized. And there's been an amazing amount of work done behind the scenes to really keep things going and to push the agenda of the department forward. And this transformation or change from being acting director to being a director is a really big deal. We haven't had a director since Chris Field left for Stanford, and you haven't, if you look at the bylaws of the institution, directors are essentially superheroes in terms of what they've got in terms of power. So that's a big deal. But I think the really big deal here is that this is essentially a vote of confidence from the institution. We've all suffered from a real sort of pail of not knowing whether we're going to be folded into another division and whether the department would actually survive. It's been 3 years of kind of uncertainty that has really been taken care of with this one fell swoop. So this is a big deal, and I'm really happy about it, as I think we all are. And what I wanted to propose was that, I wanted to say too that we're going to have 3 faculty positions coming with this as well. But what I wanted to propose is that we have a bit of a party and celebration at the 4:30 Friday normal cocktail hour that has become kind of a tradition in Zoom time here. And look forward to all of you who can joining us to celebrate this great event. So I'll turn it back over to you, Manuela, but this is a big deal and we're really happy. Thanks, Anna, and congratulations.
Thank you, Joe. And I think it's perfectly fitting that the first Zoom meeting I dial into with all of you after the announcement was sent out, when I tried to unmute myself, it said, the host has not given you permission to unmute, which sent the definite message that I'm here to listen and not to talk. And so I think it's all fitting in perfectly. But thank you, Joe. That's very kind and unexpected. So I'm happy to be here. I hope that I can basically advocate for what all of you want and need out of the department. And I'm sure I'm just thrilled that we get to hire 3 new colleagues, and I really hope that process will be really exciting for all of us here. So thank you all, and I will endeavor to do more listening than talking.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, we're really, really happy with this announcement tonight. Today, we are thrilled to have you as a director. You've been doing an amazing job. So we've been 6 minutes on, so I think we can get started with our exciting seminar today. So we have Dr. Collin Ward today giving us a seminar. Collin is an assistant science at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he has a broad interest in, but mostly focus on the rates and pathways of degradation of organic carbon in the environment. And he's done some pretty interesting work recently with the deep water horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And today he's going to talk to us about another research direction that he has, which is the persistence of plastic in the environment. So at the end, just so you know, we're going to have some time for questions. So if you want to make a question, please raise your hands. You can go to the participants when you see in Zoom, and then there's a feature of raise hands there at the end of the talk. And also Ken Cadera kindly offered to see if there are questions being made on the YouTube, and he's going to post those questions also in here on Zoom. So without further ado, please, Collin.
Thank you, Manuela. Thanks for the invitation. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks. Congrats, Anna. That's great news. I'm also delighted to hear that folks are hiring in this environment. I mean, this is something that's concerned me, is what's going to happen to all the postdocs that are looking for faculty jobs. So a cluster hire right now is really exciting to hear about. I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk to you. I am a chemist, environmental chemist at Woods Hole Oceanographic on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I would like to briefly introduce you. Before I introduce the Woods Hole, I want to make a comment about this picture on the title slide. So about 5 years ago, I started thinking about plastics in the environment, and I went to the Institute for Contemporary Art in Boston. My wife and I are members, and there is an exhibit on marine debris by Mark Dion, and he has been cataloging plastics in New Bedford here for decades, and has put together this traveling exhibit. So if you get a chance, try to check out his work. It's really inspiring, and I reached out to him, and he's been letting me use a lot of images from his exhibitions over the years, and it's just amazing catalogs that he's put together. So just a quick shout out to him. So yeah, I work at Woods Hole Oceanographic. It is the largest independent organization that's dedicated to ocean research, engineering, and education. There's 2 campuses in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. What you're seeing here is the Village campus. And you can see the 2 major ocean vessels we have, the Armstrong and the Atlantis. We have over 1,000 employees. And we also have a partnership with MIT that forms the joint program in oceanography. It's an incredible program, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to work with the students in the program. There's 5 departments on campus, and I work in the marine chemistry and geochemistry department. Typically, I like to introduce sort of one slide of what my lab does. As Manuela mentioned, I do have diverse interests. I work on a wide range of organic carbon types in aquatic ecosystems. I work on everything from permafrost organic carbon up in the Arctic to wildfire derived carbon or black carbon. I've done a lot of work on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill over the past 4 years. And most recently, I've been doing some work in the plastic pollution arena. Now, no matter what type of organic carbon I'm working on, I basically study the same 4 processes. And I study how fast these processes occur, the controls on these processes, and then how that influences the long-term fate of the organic carbon. So the one you all are most familiar with is this green arrow. It's microbial respiration of organic carbon to CO2. The one that you're probably not very familiar with is this concept that sunlight can conduct this same process. So sunlight can mineralize organic carbon to CO2 in the absence of microbes. And this has been documented for decades. The orange arrow shows a flux or a process that I have been really committed to over the past 5 years or so. It's called partial photooxidation. And what this means is that sunlight is transforming the organic carbon into new molecules that don't escape the aquatic ecosystem. They're still in the water, but they have different chemical composition. In essence, what's happening is oxygen is being added to the organic carbon, and new photoproducts, we'd say, or photochemical transformation products are formed. And then the last process is a synergistic process between sunlight and biology. So basically, some of these partially transformed compounds that are produced in orange, they are more easily or more readily degraded by microbes. And that's shown here in this yellow arrow that I refer to as the coupled photobiorespiration to CO2. So I study all these different types of organic carbon, and ultimately I'm just interested in which of these areas is most important under which circumstances, and how does that influence the fate of this organic carbon in aquatic ecosystems. I want to share a little bit about my motivation for working on plastic in the ocean. You know, I am a biogeochemist by training, and probably one of my most favorite parts of work is solving mass balances and understanding that if you can solve a mass balance, then you have a firm grasp on the controls of that cycle. About 5 years ago, when I started thinking about how sunlight was breaking down plastics, one thing that stood out to me is this narrative that the plastic budget is just extremely imbalanced, right? So if you were to estimate the amount of plastics that we think should be in the ocean right now, you'd get anywhere from 50 to 150 million tons of plastic, which is a ton of plastic. I mean, it's a lot of plastic. But if you were to, and this has been done, go out into the field and measure how much plastic is at the sea surface, which we're sampling at the sea surface because the vast majority of plastics we use are buoyant at sea, you'd find only a drop in the bucket, right? 250,000 tons of plastic. And this number of 250,000 has been refined over a decade worth of research. So obviously there's a huge imbalance here, right? We're detecting, much less than 1% of the plastic that we think should be in the ocean. And people don't know what explains this, right? There's lots of hypotheses out here. Here's a quote from Eric Van Siebel from last year. He's a preeminent modeler in the field. And he says, it's not missing like dark matter is missing. It's a different kind of missing. Nobody knows how much is at the seafloor versus how much is on the beaches, versus how much is ingested by animals, versus how much of it is already degraded by bacteria. And that is a puzzle, right? So this is one of the sort of underlying knowledge gaps that intrigues me about plastic science, in part because I think that one of the ways to explain this imbalance is that these materials might be broken down faster than we expect. So that leads to the second sort of motivating narrative, which is this concept that, I was trained from reading in the media and reading in some peer-reviewed science that, plastics are forever, right? So there's all these graphics that we see where they compare diamonds to plastic, or you'll see, social media posts where plastic is forever is a hashtag on Twitter. But also there's movies out there called, Plastic is Forever. And I think our generation was ingrained to think that when you litter, that material is going to last in the environment forever. And when you dig deep into this narrative and you start to question, well, how do they know that? You find out that maybe we don't know that as confidently as we are stating right now. And here's an example of, it's not just the media. I mean, this is an example from the United Nations. They put out a report every other year about plastics in the environment. And in this case, they're stating that plastic bags and styrofoam containers can take up to 1,000 years to decompose. To me, 1,000 years is forever. And when you read these reports, what you find is that rarely do you find a citation of peer-reviewed literature to back up the claim that these materials do last in the environment forever. What I think what they're referring to is some older literature where, folks like Kaplan and his colleagues about 40 years ago isotopically labeled different types of plastics and exposed them to microbes in soils. And what they found was that these materials do not break down in soils effectively, meaning that they're not susceptible to microbial attack. And this isn't surprising. These are really large polymers. So in some cases, these polymers are tens of thousands of Daltons long. And the largest polymer that can cross a cell membrane is 600 Daltons, right? So a microbe would have to exude an exoenzyme to lower the activation energy of breaking down that material. into a smaller monomer or a oligomer, or just metabolic product that then could be taken across the cell membrane and used for energy. And that's energetically taxing. You know, it takes a lot of energy to make those enzymes, especially when you have a lot of natural organic matter around. I can't imagine a microbe would want to eat plastic. So then the last sort of underlying narrative that intrigued me and convinced me that I should start asking questions in this field is this concept that plastics are reactive, are broken down by sunlight, but they're only broken down into smaller pieces that look just like the larger piece. So this is a quote from the GSAMP report in 2019. The GSAMP is a group of joint experts in the field. I mean, these are the leading experts in the field that put together these guidance documents for assessing plastics in the environment. And they've effectively adopted this narrative that when plastics get broken down by sunlight, there's no chemical reactions that occur, that there's just physical breakdown processes, you know, macroplastics to microplastics. And you know, I've done a lot of photochemistry, and one thing you learn is when you absorb sunlight, when an organic molecule absorbs sunlight, it produces a lot of reactive oxygen species that can transform molecules into new chemicals. So this stuck with me in thinking, well, I'm sure there's chemical reactions that occur as well. So hopefully this sets the stage for the types of assumptions that I'll be testing with my own research. The first thing we did was look into how long plastic goods last in the environment. And there's lots of reasons for trying to understand the persistence of plastic goods in the environment, and I'll talk with them in a bit. I want to first share this review that my colleagues and I just completed. We published this a month ago or a couple months ago. And what we did is we reviewed information graphics that estimate the lifetime of common plastic goods. These are graphics that are shared widely to the public and to legislators. You often see them in public places like parks and beaches and aquaria, or they're shared on social media sites. And before I dive into the results of the review, I just want to make it crystal clear that, you know, I don't get much pleasure in sharing these findings with everyone. It's not really my intent to point fingers at the accuracy or the state of the information. The reality is that these early estimates were all well-intentioned, but what we'll find out is that they're not necessarily rooted in sound science. And my big picture goal is to bring transparency to this topic so that we have better information to share with the stakeholders and to have a better assessment of the risks of this emerging pollutant. So in total, you know, we reviewed 57 graphics and documents. There are 255 estimates. The graphics came from all types of sources: government institutions, NGOs, nonprofits, college-level textbooks, for-profit companies, media outlets. You know, everywhere we could look for these graphics, we looked. And then we also did a decent job of capturing the international presence of the graphics. So there are 13 countries, 3 languages, and 4 continents were part of the review. So while I show you the infographics, they're going to be cycling in the background and you can see all the graphics we reviewed. I thought I'd provide some context on, you know, why it's critical to know the environmental persistence of any pollutant in the environment. So the first reason is simple. We're all consumers and we all want to make informed decisions. So having some information about how long a material lasts in the environment will help consumers decide if they want to choose something that breaks down quicker or persists longer. The second is that legislators need this information to develop evidence-based policy that regulates plastics at all levels, the local, national, and international level. Oh, sorry. Scientists need this information. Oh, it's going to start over again. I'm sorry about that. Scientists need this information because persistence is a key variable in models that assess the risks of plastic pollution. So there you go. something that lasts 1 year in the environment is a lot less riskier than something that persists for 500 years. And then also persistence is a key variable in fate and transport models that determine how much plastic is in the environment and where it ends up. So as I described before, there's a huge discrepancy right now between the amount of plastic that we think should be in the environment versus the plastic that we detect in the environment. And understanding the persistence of these materials might help explain that discrepancy. Then there's also a huge effort right now to clean up plastic pollution. And if we knew that one article was more persistent than another article, we could tailor new technologies towards the more persistent articles and let Mother Nature run its course on those that break down naturally. And then lastly, this is the one that hits closest to my lab's interest. I think if we can establish the controls on environmental persistence, we're more likely to be able to quickly reformulate plastics so that they break down or are attenuated more quickly in the environment. And this might be a short-term solution while other labs and other folks are working on developing more sustainable plastics and circular plastics, plastics that can be built up into polymers and then broken back down into monomers. So if you take all of this information and you were to compile it into one infographic, you get this graphic right here. And I probably spent 6 months of my life trying to make this graphic. I mean, it was just a ton of work to go through all this information and compile it. And what I have for you is 4 key take-home messages. So if you look at this graphic, you'll see the different articles, water bottles, cups, diapers, plastic bags, fishing lines, 6-pack rings, straws. You'll see the range of the estimates in the black bar, and then the mean is plotted in the red bar. And the first take-home message is that we know very little about how long these materials last in the environment. So in some cases, the estimates range from 1 to forever, right? And probably the most quintessential or best example I can give you actually comes from my home state. So here is North America, and here is Cape Cod. And you'll see the Cape Cod is this arm-looking thing, right? We always describe the Cape by an arm. And in the armpit of the arm is Woods Hole. And then 65 kilometers across the Vineyard Sound is Nantucket. And the question here is, well, how long does a plastic bag last in this environment? Does it last 10 years or 1,000 years? And if you were to ask Woods Hole Sea Grant, which is the federal government, it's part of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, they would tell you that a plastic bag lasts 1 to 20 years. But if you ask the Nantucket local government, they tell you that it lasts 500 years. So there's a 65 kilometer difference geographically, 65 kilometers apart, but it's 25 to 500 fold difference in the lifetime of the same plastic article, a bag. Right, so if our goal is to determine the risks of this emerging pollutant and to write meaningful and relevant policy, sound policy, I think we need to do a better job of understanding how long these materials last in the environment. So the second take-home message is that none of the 255 estimates from the 57 information graphics were based on peer-reviewed science. So in fact, 21 out of the 57 graphics didn't provide any citations. And when you dig deep, it seems like all of the numbers are coming from 3 primary sources. It's either NOAA, which is the Sea Grant and Marine Debris Programs, Mote Marine Lab in Sarasota, Florida, and then the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control. And to be prudent, we contacted program managers at NOAA, we contacted retired librarians at Mote Marine Lab, and they all confirmed this, this finding that there's no peer-reviewed science to back up these numbers. And I think this is a critical point because it's very important, or at least to me, I fundamentally believe that peer-reviewed science should form the foundation of environmental policy. And I want to share with you one anecdote. So when you write these types of opinion pieces, you just get bombarded with emails about everyone else's opinions. And it's pretty interesting to be on the receiving side of all those emails. For the most part, 9 out of 10 emails were from colleagues that told me that they had students working on a similar review, and it led them to this dead end. They couldn't find any of the science that supported all these data. And that was great to receive that feedback. I mean, it's great to know that I'm not alone. But the one email that really resonated with me is an email from the scientific coordinator of the Ocean Plastics Lab. Now, the Ocean Plastics Lab is this traveling exhibition that has been to 6 countries and 2 continents, and they're trying to raise awareness, and they do a great job of raising awareness about plastic pollution in the ocean. They've had over 100,000 visitors over the last few years, and this is just a picture of them in the mall in Washington, D.C. I think it was last year. And I got this email from Julia Schnetzer, who is the coordinator of the Ocean Plastics Lab. She was responsible for putting together all of the scientific exhibits and fact-checking them. And she wrote, "I just wanted to write you and tell you how much I appreciated your opinion paper. I was the scientific coordinator of the Ocean Plastics Lab. And when I was researching for the exhibition, I was desperately looking for scientific sources for the lifetime of plastic and never found them. The only cited source I ever saw was the NOAA one, but I could never find the according manuscript. I ended up using this data in the exhibition because I know it's one of the information most striking to people, but it always bugged me that it was the only information in the whole exhibition that did not have a proper scientific source. So thank you for making me feel not alone with this issue." And this, receiving this email really resonated with me. It made me feel like it was the right thing to do to write this opinion piece, in particular because it hit home with some folks that are actively engaging with the public. And that was one of the goals of writing the piece, was to reach out to stakeholders beyond academia. So the third take-home message is that unlike the recycling of plastic goods by humans, where we recycle only 10% of the plastic that we use, and that's an upper estimate, we appear to be extremely efficient at recycling these non-peer-reviewed estimates. And the best example comes from fishing line, where the average lifetime of fishing line is 600 years. And this comes from 37 different estimates for the lifetime of fishing line in the ocean. And what's happening here is there's not 37 independent studies that are all coming to the same answer of 600 years. I mean, I don't think that would ever happen in science. What's happening is they're all taking the original estimate from Marine Lab and just using it over and over and over again. And no one is fact checking to find out if that estimate actually came from peer-reviewed science. And I don't like to belabor this point, or to, sometimes I don't show this next figure, but just to show you that they are recycling. When I was walking my dog last year, I came across this infographic at my local beach. And this is from the 11th Hour Racing organization. It's a nonprofit funded by the Schmidt Foundation. And what they did is they took the 600-year estimate, but whoever made this graphic decided that it was okay to move it to use fish hooks instead of fishing line. So now these infographics are suggesting that stainless steel has the same lifetime in the ocean as nylon, which I am not a material scientist, but I suspect that this is not accurate. Okay, so the last take-home message before I transition into some of my own research is that I think that the wording of these graphics lacks precision. So never do you see anything about what degradation means. You never see a definition of degradation. By degradation, do we mean complete mineralization to carbon dioxide, or partial oxidation to new products, or merely physical degradation into smaller particles? all of these different classes of products have completely different risks to ecosystem and human health. So we need to be more precise about our language when we talk about degradation. And then we also need to be more precise about discussing where and how degradation happens, because these rates vary depending on the environmental context. Presumably the rates are a lot different in oceans versus rivers versus the bottom of a lake or the bottom of the ocean in sediments. But this isn't truly established yet. So most studies, if you look into the infographics or you just look into the literature, most studies assume that microbes are the only pathway by which plastic can be broken down. And for example, if you look at the GSAMP report from last year, they explicitly state, it is only with the intervention of microorganisms that the polymer will start to break down into its component elements. So this old view in my mind is that only microbes can break down plastic to CO2. And what I'll share with you today are findings from my lab that we reported last year, where we show that in the absence of microbes, sunlight can transform polystyrene into water-soluble compounds and carbon dioxide, and that these pathways happen on much, much faster timescales than what's reported by the United Nations. They happen on decadal to centennial timescales. Okay, so I want to briefly familiarize yourself with photochemistry. Everyone has experienced photochemical reactions before. Probably the most common way to think about, or the easiest way to think about photochemistry is the fading of pigments, whether it's the pigments in your clothes and how sunlight fades them over time, or the pigments in the paint that are in your car and how they fade in sunlight. In the natural environment, this is actually a slide from an outreach activity that we put together, where you can leach organic carbon from tea and watch the fading occur over time by sunlight. But this happens in rivers. So think about, when a river is, flushed into the ocean, you see that the color of the water changes from dark brown into light blue. And part of that is dilution, but part of it is also photobleaching. So this is where the chromophoric organic matter that's in the river water is being broken down by sunlight, turning it into much lighter looking chemicals. And that's shown here for tea. We did the same thing for orange crush, right? You see something in orange crush is extremely photoreactive. And then the same thing for all your favorite soft drinks or adult beverages. They all fade with time. And this happens for plastics as well, right? As you saw by the image on the title slide, where you see the many shades of a Gatorade cap. So what does this mean from a chemistry standpoint? Well, and how does this happen? There's basically two different ways. The first is easiest to comprehend. It's called direct photooxidation. So what happens is there's a chromophore that absorbs natural sunlight, and that can lead to the breaking of chemical bonds. And in this process, you can change the structure of the chemical, and you can also produce CO2. So I would call this partial oxidation, changing the black from orange, and then in red, that's called complete photooxidation, where you're actually mineralizing the organic carbon back to inorganic carbon. Now, a more complicated one, and something that I study all the time, I'm really interested in, is this concept that when sunlight is absorbed by a chromophore, it produces a suite of reactive oxygen species. And this includes everything from hydroxyl radical to superoxide, hydrogen peroxide, singlet oxygen. All of these different reactive oxygen species have a higher capacity to react with a broader class of organic molecules, not just the ones that absorb light directly. And that's shown here in the middle panel, where ROS are being produced. And then in the right panel, you see that lots of different shapes representing different types of molecules can be broken down by sunlight. And this pathway also leads to partially oxidized compounds as well as CO2. So when I was a graduate student working on Arctic carbon cycling, permafrost carbon cycling up in the Arctic, I developed this method where we could measure the relative importance of partial and complete photooxidation for organic carbon. And I did this with Rose Corey at the University of Michigan. And what we do is we shine light on organic carbon, and we simultaneously measure the oxygen consumption and the CO2 production. And this is in the absence of microbes. This is a solely abiotic reaction, right? So if for plastic A, using this example, you have the same amount of oxygen consumption as you do CO2 production. And if you assume that 1 mole of oxygen is required to produce 1 mole of CO2, you'd say that all of the oxygen that was consumed went into the CO2 that was produced. Now for plastic B, you have 3-fold higher oxygen consumption than CO2 production. So this first third of oxygen consumption goes into the CO2, and the remaining 2/3, that's the oxygen that gets incorporated into the organic carbon to form these new partially oxidized compounds. So in this case, there's plastic B is more susceptible to partial photooxidation than plastic A. So a couple of years ago, I adapted this method to investigate how polystyrene breaks down in the environment. And I was working with my graduate student. This is Anna Walsh, shown here. She's just characterizing the optical properties of a couple plastic films. So we purchased 5 different sources of polystyrene. We've started simple, working with pure virgin material, so no additives, all the way up to consumer grade materials, meaning these are the plastics that are in the actual products you use in your everyday lives. And of course, these contain additives. And then one of the goals was to estimate the relative importance and the timescales of partial and complete photooxidation. So I'll first start with complete oxidation. And the first question is, well, does this material get converted to CO2 by sunlight? And in all cases, every single source got converted to CO2 by sunlight. And this was a pretty surprising finding. Folks had hypothesized it before, but they hadn't actually demonstrated it. And it was also exciting because we demonstrated it for virgin materials that didn't have additives all the way up to consumer relevant products. So that, we dug a little bit deeper. Of course, you shine more light on the plastic, you get more DIC or CO2. And this, again, is an important finding because it challenges this paradigm that only microbes are capable of mineralizing plastic into CO2. But we didn't stop there. One of my big goals of coming to Woods Hole was to learn how to incorporate isotope geochemistry into photochemistry. And I saw this as a great opportunity to incorporate natural abundance radiocarbon measurements to track the mineralization of the plastic into CO2. So luckily we have this amazing facility on campus. It's called NOSAMS. It's the National Ocean Sciences Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Facility. You basically have this huge accelerator that's charged to 500 kilovolts. So, a standard plug is 120 volts. This is 500,000 volts. And the ions are traveling at 50 million miles per hour, which then allows you to separate out the light from the heavy ions, so 12 from 14C. And what our hypothesis was is to basically leverage the fossil signature of plastic and track that signature over time. So this is just a basic graphic showing all the different ways that people talk about natural abundance radiocarbon. I'm going to be using this notation here. This is delta 14C, where 0 corresponds to modern, meaning that the CO2 in the organic carbon was fixed recently. So it was photosynthesized recently. And then -1,000 means that it's a fossil origin. So it's at least 50,000 years old, which is the limit of detection of modern day accelerators. So the idea here is that, well, plastic is derived of fossil carbon, but the atmosphere is derived of young carbon. So theoretically, if we, in a closed vial, if we have, water, we have background CO2, which is young, and we have polystyrene in there, and we shine light on it, we should get more CO2, but the CO2 should also be older, and it should match the composition of the polystyrene film itself. So we did this hypothesis, or we tested this hypothesis, and we found pretty much exactly what we expected. So I'm going to orient you real quick. On the x-axis is delta 13C, which we haven't covered, but oil is over here at -30 per mil, and calcium carbonate is over here at 0 to -10 per mil. And then the y-axis is the delta 14C, so modern down here at 0, and then old up here at -1,000. So not surprisingly, the polystyrene is completely dead, meaning it's comprised of 100% fossil carbon, and it has a 13C signature of -30 per mil, which is also indicative of petroleum-sourced organic carbon. And there's actually 3 dots sitting on top of one another. You can't see that. So what we did is we had a dark control where we have the CO2 in the vessel has essentially just equilibrated with the atmosphere in the lab. And as you can tell, it's very young, and it's derived of, not organic carbon. But as you shine light on the material, what you're doing is you're pushing the signature out towards the polystyrene in green, right? And if you only pay attention to the y-axis right now, you'll see that our predicted values in blue were very much in line with our observed values in orange. And that tells us that the source of the CO2 has the same age as the polystyrene. This is direct confirmation that the polystyrene is being converted to CO2. Now, what's interesting is that on the x-axis, there's an offset, a slight offset. And I think that's due to mass-dependent fractionation, which has only been reported once before for photochemical processes and photochemical mineralization. And we're following up on this, this hypothesis right now. But it could be an interesting way to track plastic over time is to look at how you're preferentially degrading that 12/13C carbon. So the next question is, well, we know that these materials are susceptible to complete photooxidation, which is shown in red, but what about partial photooxidation? And in all cases, there was more oxygen consumption than CO2 production. On average, the ratio is around 4. But what's really interesting is that the 2 consumer relevant products, those with additives, they had extremely high O2 to CO2 ratios, meaning that those additives are changing the pathways by which they're being broken down by sunlight. So because we're adding oxygen to the backbone, the material is getting more and more soluble, it's getting more polar, and it wants to interact with water. And that's exactly what we see when we shine light on the material. We get more and more dissolved organic carbon that's basically partitioning into the water. And this is not a new finding. This is actually, this has been documented for years, and most recently, there were 2 papers in 2018 that were really great, showing that when you shine light on different types of plastic, you get smaller chemical fragments that partition into the water phase. So if you take this all together, I can wrap up these findings and sort of give you some perspective on how I see plastic fate in the environment, and then also talk about a couple next directions that my lab is moving. So if you were to, consider sunlight and, run some calculations for how long these materials were to last in a sunlit environment, the lifetimes would be on the order of 10 to 100-fold shorter than reported by the United Nations. These lifetimes are still long, right? So, this is basically predicting that this material would dissolve into the water column on a decadal time scale, but it's certainly not forever, right? We don't know how this varies for different types of plastic. And there's also more work to be done about longer term experiments to see how the rates vary over time. I will say that there's a paper that came out after I published this, and they reported lifetimes of a couple years. So I was a little surprised by how fast their materials reacted, but it still was supportive of this concept that when you consider these alternative products, not just physical degradation products, you get shorter lifetimes. So how has this work sort of changed the narrative and thinking about the fate of these materials in the environment? I'd like to think that people are more cognizant of it's not as simple as large going to small. When sunlight breaks down plastic, there are chemical reactions that occur, and this changes the chemical composition and ultimately the fate of these materials in the environment. So we used to think about, oh, well, this plastic cup would just break down into smaller and smaller pieces. And now I like to think that folks are at least aware or discussing the possibility that there are other types, there are other classes of products. So here you have these water-soluble products, but you also have gas phase products like carbon dioxide. Some of the next steps that my lab is heading in is to really embrace this concept of the complexity of plastic in the environment. So, I think some folks have this perception that plastic is just, 7 numbers, whatever the recycling number is. And, an article that has a number 1 on it is the exact same article as a different one, right? So all things made of polyethylene are equal. And that's not really true. I mean, it's actually incredibly complicated where, you have the polymers that are used, but you also have all these different additives. You have the different types of use, which impact, whether or not that material has a likelihood of being leaked into the environment. The size of the material impacts its fate, right? So some folks think surface area to volume is the number 1 controlling variable of lifetime. That hasn't been tested, but that's a hypothesis out there. Morphology is critical, right? That's going to influence surface area to volume as well. And then also color plays a role in fate, right? So certain pigments can catalyze degradation. So my lab is really embracing this concept that we need to investigate how formulation plays a role in the fate. And then the next thing we're actively working on is evaluating whether or not these photo products are toxic. Are there risks of these photo products to aquatic animals? And then also, are they labile to microbes? There's been one study so far showing that when you shine light on certain types of plastics, it facilitates microbial degradation in the ocean. So it suggests that this process is happening, but this hasn't been explored across a lot of diverse formulations yet. So to conclude with you all, I want to make it clear that, this work shouldn't be used as justification for continuing our unsustainable demand for consumer plastics. I mean, it's kind of crazy what our demand is right now, and it's only going up. And it also shouldn't be used to justify littering. I mean, you'd be shocked at the way folks spin this science. I mean, it's kind of wild. All I'm doing is calling for a more complete understanding of what happens to these materials, so hopefully we can make more informed decisions. I think it's pretty clear that we have a poor understanding of how long these materials last in the environment, and I would argue that we have an even poorer understanding of how the breakdown pathways vary across space and time, how these different product classes vary. And that's important to consider because they all have their different risks associated with them. This work showed that sunlight exposure appears to be a governing control of the persistence of polystyrene. This is not a huge surprise given the size of the polystyrene polymer and the structure of it, but it's still important to consider sunlight when we're thinking about the fate of polystyrene in the environment. We also showed that fragmentation is just far more complicated than, large going to small, right? There's these different product classes, and measuring these product classes may help us balance the plastic budget right now. And then lastly, I always close with this. I'm always going to make a pitch for risk assessment and fate models to account for light-driven processes. Right now, when you look at the leading modelers and what actually feeds their models and their algorithms, sunlight is not a variable they're considering, despite the fact that there's loads of evidence showing that sunlight is driving fragmentation and leading to this diverse class of products. So we really need to embrace, I think we really need to take a step forward and incorporate photochemical processes into these models. All right, so that's all I have for you. I do want to thank collaborators. Chris Reddy is a big, close colleague of mine. We work on a lot of topics together. Anna Walsh is a graduate student, and then I had a bunch of technicians and summer interns that helped with this work. And then I received funding internally from Woods Hole, and then some funding from some private foundations, the Seaver Institute and the Gerstner Foundation. So I'm happy to take any questions you all have.
Thank you so much, Collin, for this very interesting talk and the important work that you're doing. Everybody, we do have a few minutes for questions. So again, if you have any question, please raise your hand on Zoom. So if you go to participants, I see you raising your hands. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, I was wondering if there's any estimates about what the distribution of light exposure is for different pieces of plastic released into the environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So no, folks have not incorporated, just vertical mixing, for instance, into models right now, but this is something that is actively being worked on. And I'm writing a proposal right now with a modeler to think about, well, how does density change over time, and how does that impact basically the distribution of plastics vertically in a water column versus the attenuation coefficients of light in the water column. And I will use this as an opportunity to show you a couple, if I can, extra slides. So one of the findings that I didn't report on is this concept that some formulations, and this is, sorry, the titles I'll screw up, but some formulations are, depending on what additives are in the plastics, they actually break down in the visible region, and we don't have a firm grasp of what the wavelength dependence of these reactions is. Is it always UV light that drives it, or is it visible light? And the reason this is important is because there's 10 times greater visible light at Earth's surface, and then visible light penetrates, much, much deeper into the water column. And this is the basis of a big proposal that a colleague and I are trying to put together, is incorporating wavelength dependence into vertical distribution models for how fast this would actually happen. I hope that answers your question.
Joe, you're next. If you want to unmute yourself, Joe Barry.
Thanks, Collin. Really, really interesting. I was curious, since plastics in the ocean absorb UV light, is there any way of getting estimates based on satellite albedos in the UV?
Yeah, it's an active, the short answer is the resolution's not there yet. Some of these pieces of plastic are millimeter size and smaller. And but folks are actively working on this. And I just participated in a Beaver Works Summer Institute. I was volunteering for this program up at Lincoln Labs and MIT. And the whole topic of the program was to have high school kids work on developing CubeSats to detect plastics in the ocean. And, you know, ultimately, one of the ideas is floating around is if you could look at a macroplastic, right? You could track it over space and time and estimate the loss of material from that macroplastic. But my understanding is that the resolution isn't there yet to really track these smaller sized particles.
But we have things like the big garbage patch. So even a satellite with poor resolution, say 10 kilometers or something like that, might be able to see the concentration of plastics in these patches, as opposed to being able to resolve the specific size and dimensions or optical properties of individual plastic pieces.
Yeah, I'm happy you brought up the garbage patch. I think this is something, I don't like to talk about this that often, but I think it's something that folks should be aware that the concentration of plastics in the garbage patch is on the order of like 1 to tens of pieces of plastic per 1,000 liters of water, right? So when they say it's a garbage patch, it just means that there is a concentration of plastic relative to other waters outside of the garbage patch. So it's not as if there is there's just tons of plastic out there floating that folks can see from space. It's not like a harmful algal bloom where it looks like, you know, split pea soup from space. These are really low concentrations of plastic. They're just higher, elevated relative to more pristine waters.
Great. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Andre, do you want to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I, well, being as a polymer, having a PhD in polymer science, I was wondering if, since you didn't really find any real journals or articles outlining the real time of degradation, I'm wondering if all this degradation times for the different plastics were coming from time temperature superposition principle for the different types of plastics, in a sense that how fast do they actually fall apart and become individual molecules instead of just a bulk object, so passing their glass transition temperature over time. And that might give you a clue of whether all this data has been really pulled out of just, well, of that number, which doesn't even mean degradation, it's just falling apart of a big piece.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we actually don't know exactly where the numbers came from, but I spent I don't know, probably 4 or 5 phone calls with a retired librarian down at Mote Marine Lab, and they suggested that in 1993 there were a series of volunteers that came up with the original infographic that they were selling at the Mote Marine Lab gift shop. And they don't have records for where they got the numbers from, but I have to assume that they came up with some relationship that then they extrapolated out. And at the time, microplastics wasn't a thing, right? So that hadn't even been defined. So you can rule out things like surface area to volume ratio, but maybe they were using some of these physical properties to come up with the estimates.
I'm just suggesting that, and it's a fairly simple thing to do. So really look into the time temperature superposition principle for all these plastics and see if, you know, somebody just came up with that in 93 and just dropped all those numbers. I mean, it's not related to metals in the table like aluminum cans, but definitely is related to all the plastics in a way. How fast would they just fall apart? But as you're right, totally correct that, you know, it has nothing to do with change in chemical properties. It's just physically just falling apart of a bulk big object into smaller ones, which can then potentially maybe be eaten by bacteria or not.
Yep, I agree with you. I would love to know where the numbers came from, but I sort of, at some point, you just got to cut your losses and move on. You know?
No, I think we're all really appreciative for your efforts. It's really looking into proper science and really backing it up with solid data. Thank you.
Thanks.
Leslie, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Collin. I really enjoyed your presentation. I wondered, with CO2 as a byproduct or product of degradation of these plastics, is there a way to estimate, or has it been modeled, how much of that contributes to atmospheric carbon, or to actually measure it using isotopes?
Yeah, there is. I mean, the short answer is it's just not enough. So on the first slide, the estimate was 50 to 150 million tons, right? I mean, to impact climate change, you need to be in the petagram region, right? You need to be billion tons. So like when I think about my work in the Arctic, the reason I get so excited to go up in the Arctic is because there's 1,000 petagrams of carbon that are stored up there. So a small fraction would be in the petagram range. So that, you know, let's just assume all of the plastics that we thought would go into the ocean or in the ocean would magically be mineralized. It would be a drop in the bucket compared to the fossil fuels we're burning each year. You know, we're adding like 10, you know, someone on this call is better at this than I am, but I think the net addition from burning fossil fuels is on the order of 10 petagrams of CO2 per year. So it's just not, there's just orders of magnitude different.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for one more question. I think Ken said that there is some questions on YouTube. Ken, would you mind asking?
Yeah. Yes, the main question is, I understand that you're a chemist and not an environmental toxicologist or something like that, but there's a question, if you could just say something about likely environmental consequences of these plastics in the ocean.
Of the photo products or just in general?
I think the question was a more general question.
So the one that, you know, most folks are concerned about for obvious reasons is that if these materials get broken down into small enough pieces, there's an ingestion risk, right? So once you produce microplastics and really nanoplastics, you get into this territory where the plastics don't get dislodged as easily and they may disrupt different processes. Or if they're small enough, you know, you could cross cellular membranes. You know, once you get into nanometer size plastic, like tens of nanometers, right? That's getting into the territory of crossing like blood-brain barriers for humans or for fish, and into different organs. So that's a legitimate concern. That the problem with that is once you start playing this game of looking at smaller and smaller plastic pieces, it becomes really hard analytically to detect nanoplastics, right? There's just a really challenging, analytically, it's really challenging to do. So folks are trying to develop new technologies to make that easier. From a photo product perspective, I am intrigued about how the additives play a role. So, you know, if you were to break polyethylene up into a lot of oxidized products, it would just become carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? That's probably just food for a microbe. But if there's an additive in there, let's say there's a brominated flame retardant, maybe you make organohalogen compounds, and that starts to concern me. And that's sort of the path that I'm taking and working with toxicologists.
Okay, so it's 5 past, but we do have one more question for Joe. So Joe, do you want to make your question and then we wrap up? Joe Barry, you're muted. I don't know if you're trying to speak.
Thank you. I missed that. Yeah, I'm interested in the biogeochemical cycle of carbonyl sulfide, a an analog of CO2 that has sulfur in its place. And your talk sort of got me thinking about what role might photodecomposition of plastics play as a source of that. And I'd love to talk with you offline about that.
Yeah. In general, there's not that much sulfur in plastics, but I'm going through my brain of what's in
Rayon.
Wait, sorry, say it again.
Rayon. So the only plastic I know of that has has sulfur in it is rayon, and then of course tires and anything that's vulcanized.
Yeah, so one of the additives they put in a lot of plastics is just rubber particles, and the reason for that is to make it more durable, so it can withstand sort of, think about the classic example is polystyrene. If you have a styrofoam container, it's not very durable, right? But if you have a CD case that's made out of polystyrene, it's very durable, and there's often rubber particles in that to make it this high impact material. So there's sulfur in that for sure, and we detected it in our study. And there's some other, and we can talk offline, but there's some other reasons you would suspect a little bit of sulfur, but it's not, in my mind, it's not the list that I'd go after.
Yeah,
but
it may be a catalytic, or maybe something that could be used as a tracer, because
yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one consequence of any environmental disasters, you often get to use these unintended releases as tracers, right? So think about above ground nuclear testing, but also plastics have been great for circulation models as well.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Collin. This was, we can see for the amount of questions that this was a very popular topic. And this was great in these unusual times to be able to have this seminar. So thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.